Everywhere we go, we can't help but consider how much everything will cost. It affects every single decision of our day. So, what's the role of big government in our economy, and do they have the track record to do that well? To answer this and more, I'm happy to welcome Mathew Lau, who holds a degree in commerce, years of experience in the banking industry, and whose popular columns can be seen regularly in the Financial Post. Stay tuned to hear how supply and demand control the prices of goods and how you can take back control of where your money goes.
Today, a special episode of Return to Reason, where knowledge and wisdom intersect.
All right, Mathew, it is so good to have you on Return to Reason. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Well, when it came up to this topic and understanding inflation and cost of living and the government's role, you are quite diverse in your covering it. And so I just want to ask you, what is it that you think, why is it you think Canadians need to know about this, and why do we have to address these topics?
Well, I think there's a lot of misconception around inflation and how best to tackle it.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that misconception is the result of governments that may often cause inflation while trying to tell you that they're trying to lessen it.
Yes.
So one of my favorite examples is government spending programs. So if you go to the federal budget, for example, and they will tell you that they are trying to provide inflation relief. And one of the ways they might do that is by providing increased payments to seniors or government subsidization of childcare and this, that, or the other program.
Yeah.
The problem is that government spending is inflationary.
Yes.
And when government splashes money around like this, that's one of the things that drives up prices. So I think it's important to talk about inflation and what's really causing inflation.
Well,
And
before we get there,
yes,
what's the problem with inflation? Let's just start there.
inflation is really when the standard definition is that prices are rising, and it's generally because you have too much money chasing too few goods.
Yes.
And when prices rise, it makes things less affordable for families.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, one of the ones that gets talked about a lot is food prices are getting more expensive, gasoline is getting more expensive.
Yeah.
Childcare is getting more expensive. If you look at the total cost, it might be cheaper. The out-of-pocket cost might be cheaper, but we're paying more of it through taxes. So when things become more
Wow.
expensive, the standard of living declines.
Okay, so back to initially what you were saying, where the government says in the name of trying to save you all, we'll just print some more money and send it off your way. And that's a problem.
Right, exactly. So when the government subsidizes something, they often say, "Well, we're making it cheaper. We're making it more affordable."
Yeah.
And the reality is they're absolutely not. I've never heard of government really making things cheaper. They can try to hide the
Yeah.
costs,
Yeah.
or they can, shift the cost from one person to another or from one place to another. But at the end of the day, in order to have things cheaper and to have things more abundant and to raise our standards of living, we need to be more productive. And I've never heard of the government, a government program or government managing an industry in order to make it more productive. That's unheard of,
Yeah.
right? The government is not making the childcare sector, for example, more efficient by subsidizing it. It doesn't make food or farmers,
Yes. Yeah.
their operations more efficient by trying to control or subsidize how farms work.
If you were the government, what would you do though? Like, you know what I mean? So like, what are their actual choices there in trying to bring relief? Because I want to play the advocate a little bit, because if you are the little man, that the person who's at the bottom and just doesn't have a choice, what do they do? So like, which is why programs like even just minimum wage, on the surface level, you're going, thank you, like thank you for raising minimum wage. But I think it's if you extrapolate that, the price to pay for that is maybe another employee losing their job.
Well, the problem is it's really a problem of poverty then. If you're looking at people who can't afford, food, or they need to raise their standards of living above a certain baseline, that's really a problem of poverty. And the problem or the solution to addressing poverty is to very directly address it by transferring, for example, funds to low-income people. It wouldn't be to have a subsidization of an entire sector or a government
Oh
regulation that
yeah, I see what
affects
you're
an
saying.
entire
Yep.
sector.
Yep.
Or a minimum wage, for example. Most minimum wage earners are not from poor families, so it's very badly targeted. It's just the two problems I've described. One of them is that you're going to cut the very lowest skilled workers out of the labor market.
Yep.
And the second one is for those workers that who do see their wages go up. They're generally not from poor families in the first place.
More of this conversation in a few minutes.
During COVID, they released payments to people. It's called CERB. What I saw during that was actually everybody and their dog applying for it. Like it was just everywhere. And the people that, in my opinion, there's so many people that I saw that shouldn't have. And but at the same time too, there was no real policing on it, and it kind of actually made, like, we're going to be paying this off for 4 or 5 generations to come, if not maybe more. And the price to pay for it is just so huge.
Right, the COVID price was very big. Now COVID is slightly different because not all of those programs were strictly poverty relief.
Yes. Yeah.
Some of it is if you lock down somebody's business, you have to compensate them, whether they're rich,
Yes.
poor, or anything in
Yeah.
between. So there is COVID is a bit of a special case, but I
Yeah.
think there is a very strong case to be made that the government spent way too much money in COVID
Yeah.
and did it very poorly.
You mentioned earlier about environmental policies on restricting goods and services and where the government roles in that, but you had an article about that. What was going on in that video?
Right. So there was a video that was widely viewed as I think it
Hmm.
was several months ago
I've
about
seen it.
a
Yeah.
dairy farmer that had to dump many thousands of liters of milk. And what is going on here is that the government has a program in place called supply management. And so the agricultural output in Canada is basically managed and limited by the government in order to keep the prices of farm goods up. So, in the name of, keeping farm prices stable and keeping farmers' income stable, they want to basically inflate the prices by restricting the output of a lot of farm outputs like milk and poultry.
Yeah.
And the consequence of that, of course, is that farms become less productive and we all pay more for groceries to the tune of several of dollars more per year
Yeah.
per person.
Supply and demand, right? That's just basic economics 101. Too much supply,
Yeah,
low price. Too much, not enough supply, you got high price. So where is the line on that? Now, the reason I say that is it's when you look at it through the eye of like a free people outside of government structure. Well, we just want to make the most so everybody can have the most and we all live a great life. But when you're
yeah,
looking at it through a business owner who's putting their life on the line and working themselves to the bone to just try to make the best product, get the most profits, and pay the most, and like, so do they want to put out more or do they want a higher price? What is the farmer's perspective on it? And then also, if I was a farmer and I was just a small farmer, but you were a major farmer and you could produce 1,000 times more than me, I would eventually have to go out of business to the big guy in town.
right. Now, the entire point of the economy and the entire point of businesses is to produce things that people demand and want to
Yes.
consume.
Hmm.
That's how we raise our standard of living. Now, in theory, I don't know if this is really the case in practice, but in theory,
Yep.
if it was much more efficient to produce food only on big farms, we
Yep.
really only should have big farms.
Hmm.
We don't need to subsidize the little guy.
It's a good
And the
point.
little guy, I mean, it has always been the case in order to have economic progress,
Yes.
people have to find new jobs and new roles, and there's always that amount of churn. For example, if you go back, 100 years, 200 years,
Hmm.
a lot more people worked on farms, and it took a lot more people,
Yep.
to feed the population. And as the economy progressed, we have a more service-based economy. We have a wealthier economy. We produce a lot more things in our economy now than just
Absolutely.
food,
Yep.
because we don't, we can produce all sorts of things that are not necessities, whereas
Yes.
before we were only focused on producing necessities.
Yep.
And the result of that is a lot of people over the years on farms have had to lose their jobs as
Yep.
maybe they went into factories, maybe they went into the service economy, but that's always how the economy is always changing and the
Yes.
economy is always progressing. And that's
Yep.
how over time our standards of living rise.
Yep.
So I wouldn't, when you're looking at a little farm and a big farm, or a little business and a big business,
Hmm.
I think it's an error to try to, keep something alive that's not really producing.
Yeah,
We have to free up those resources in order to have a more productive and a more vibrant economy, and in order for the economy to progress and grow.
totally. And I guess what you're saying there, correct me if I'm wrong, please do, is the government's policies are actually almost allowing unproductive things to exist, which halts the progression of the economy. Is that right?
Well, that's exactly right. And in the case of supply management, they are actively restricting the output, the restricting production, deliberately keeping
Wow.
production down.
Yes.
So that is, it is very clearly a drag on the economy, and it,
Yeah.
in the very short run, it does, protect some farmers and help some businesses stay alive, as you
Yeah.
say. But in the long run, we all pay for it.
Return to Reason will continue after these messages.
One of the misconceptions I find with the socialist style programs, um, I saw a video a while ago of Jim Carrey going on and bragging about our medical system up in Canada. And I was floored. Like I wanted to go on there going, have you ever gone to an emergency room? Have you ever had a real emergency issue that you've had to deal with in Canada? Now, there's of course benefits. And of course there's free coverage for all. And I've heard all the arguments, I've had them all. But when you need something done and you need it done in an emergency, the private sector will solve that problem 1,000 times quicker. Yes, there's a cost, but the private sector brings the privilege of you being able to sometimes save your life. It's just
That's
wild.
absolutely true. And you can see in the statistics a lot, tens of thousands, or maybe several hundreds of thousands of Canadians every year
Hmm.
travel out of the country in order to get health care, because you
Hmm.
can't get it in this country in a timely fashion.
Yeah.
Now, the United States has their own problems with healthcare, and
Yes.
it's a mess down there.
Yeah.
But one of the problems they do not have is with waiting times.
Yeah.
Now, to me, the problem with the medical system is you have the government taking control of an entire sector.
Yeah.
Um, and it's in the name of, making sure everybody can afford or has access to a certain level of care.
Yeah.
Now, to me, this comes back to the poverty problem. If you want people to access a certain level of care or a certain
Totally.
level of, anything, it's really, you want to solve poverty.
Hmm.
You don't really want a government takeover of an entire sector in the name
Totally.
of, you know, helping the poor. That's
Hmm.
just a very bad way of doing it. And the government has made a mess of healthcare.
Yeah. Yeah. It absolutely has. And um, I don't even know if there's a clear road to fixing it. I don't know. I would imagine policy and discussion and voting appropriately, and that's why these conversations are important. But sometimes it almost feels helpless. It almost feels like there's just no ability to change it. But we've got to continue to talk about it all.
It's absolutely correct. And, some governments have made some marginal improvements in
Hmm.
healthcare. So, for example, I think it's a very good thing that the Ontario government is allowing you to get an expanded amount of treatment, still paid for out of the public purse, but they're allowing more private provision of
Yes.
healthcare.
Yeah.
You s- Um, I think that's a very good thing, but that's only
Yeah.
a marginal change. I think really you need to scale back the amount of government control of healthcare
Hmm.
in a very dramatic way before you have any real improvement.
Well, and it'll exponentially benefit the public sector, because as the system's relieved, you know what I mean? As you pull people out of the public sector and they go to private, they're both going to win. You're going to have people who are running businesses excelling and winning and gaining profits, as well as relief from the public. So
Yeah.
it just
It
makes
is
sense.
one of the I guess you could say insane things about our healthcare system is we have a lot of people in Canada who have foreign credentials to be
Hmm.
doctors,
Yeah. Oh God.
and they
Yes.
want to practice, and they're perfectly good doctors,
Yeah.
and the government just won't hire more doctors because the government doesn't want to pay for more doctors. We only have a very limited amount of roles. And then you have people who want to see a doctor and who are willing to pay to see a doctor out of their own pocket, even though they've already paid taxes. why can't those people who want to pay to see a doctor
Yeah.
pay to see the doctors who
Yes.
aren't being allowed to practice? It's nuts.
Okay. Can you bring
But
clarity to
because we
that?
have,
Are you saying there's like a quota for the nation of Canada that the government's just saying, nope, we're done, can't hire anymore? Is that what
well,
you're saying? Kind of.
well, for example, well, the government does, have a very strict control
Hmm.
over um, practice of medicine, right? They do control, for example, the hospital's budgets. They control the number of residencies, the number of residencies for newly trained doctors. Um, the government will have regulations, for example, after you get your training, where
Yeah.
are you allowed to practice? For example, if somebody has just received their training overseas and they come back to Canada, the government may have a regulation about you have to go to an underserved community to practice. The basic problem with the government organization of industry, right, is that the government just doesn't have the information in order
Yeah.
to plan. All of the economic information in the economy is held by individuals. It's held
Yeah.
at the bottom level.
Yeah.
And that's why the economy works best and makes the most use of information when you put individuals in command
Yeah.
and let them make their own decisions as opposed to have the government try to control everything.
Return to Reason conversations continue after this.
You mentioned in some of the research I've done on you is you talk about environmental social governance, and can you expand on that? What is it?
Yes, well, so the popular acronym these days is ESG, right?
Oh,
Environmental, social, and governance. And that what that basically is when businesses, often at the urging of governments or as a
yeah.
result of government regulation, turn their focus towards solving environmental or social problems.
Hmm.
And the problem about that is that I think it's one of the main insights of modern economics, where Adam Smith said, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher that and the brewer and the baker that we have our dinner. It's with regard to their own self-interest, right? The economy works best when businesses are laser focused on how best to innovate in order to solve problems for
Yeah.
consumers and
Yeah.
to make things better and cheaper, and get as many
Totally.
consumers and customers as possible to earn as much profit as possible.
Yeah.
The economic growth and the level of prosperity we enjoy today
Yeah.
is not the results of businesses trying to solve social problems.
Yeah.
It's the result of businesses trying to earn profits, and in that they create a lot of economic surplus for
Hmm.
employers, for investors, for employees, for consumers, and that's where our standard of living really comes from.
That I couldn't have actually said it any better, any better myself. Sorry, I just want to get a little clarity on that. Is the environmental, social, the ESG? Do they essentially have it for each sector of the farming world? Like, there's heavy governance on them all, and how does that governance work?
Well, if you want to look at the farm sector in particular, I think it's the main issue there is that the government is forcing standards and environmental standards
Yeah.
on the farm sector that just don't make a lot of sense.
So when they're enforcing it, though, are they enforcing output, or you're talking about actually how they achieve their output, like the way they're farming?
Well, for example, the government wants to regulate the fertilizer use of farmers in order to reduce
Oh, I
carbon
see. Okay.
emissions,
Yeah.
right? And the problem with that is they're trying to make farms more environmentally responsible, or trying to put the burden of solving an environmental problem on
Okay, I get what you're saying.
farms.
Yeah.
And that may not be a very good way of doing it. If you look at, if you try to do a cost benefit analysis of how much more are the farms going, how much more in costs are farms going to incur in
Okay.
order to produce a certain unit of food while using less fertilizer? You
Hmm.
know, how much is that going to cost versus how much benefit to the environment is there?
So what do you suggest they could do maybe to like, is there a win-win here? Can they be environmentally friendly? Or maybe you're saying it's up to us as the free citizens to solve the environmental problems. Like, what would you say? because we do need to keep those costs low. But what else? What's our another choice?
So the standard case, now different environmental problems
Hmm.
have different environmental solutions. Now, the
Yes, of
big
course.
environmental problem that is often talked about today is climate change.
Yeah,
And it's generally the case, and most economists will say, and I think they're right, is that the best or the most targeted way to solve the greenhouse gas problem is to just put a tax on greenhouse gases. Once you have the tax, that
yeah,
should be your sole policy. You can't say we're going to have a tax and at the same time we're going to ban this, that, and the other and tell the farms and the auto industry and consumers how to operate.
yeah,
That just destroys the entire logic of the tax in the first place.
yeah,
And the second issue with the tax is um, because our economy needs greenhouse gases in order to be productive, a carbon tax is sort of like an income tax.
yeah,
Um, and in order to reduce the economic harm of this carbon tax, which it acts like an income tax, you need to scale back the income tax, whether it's personal income or
yeah,
corporate income. That's how most economists will say you want to deal with climate change.
yeah. But you've brought a lot of insight here, I think, to to many different questions. And I'd love to have you on again sometime, possibly, where we could flesh out more ideas, because it just affects us all so greatly here in the topics of inflation and money and the government's role and medical and it's really been great. So I appreciate you, Matthew, for joining us on today's program, and I just want to say thank you.
Thank you.
You are an essential part of this series. Support truth, knowledge, and wisdom by sharing this show with a friend. Visit returntoreason.tv. There, you can subscribe to our newsletter by clicking Become an Insider. Get the latest articles, episodes, and exclusive content. It's Return to Reason.